I've often reflected that there is nothing quite so deceptively peaceful as an English country manor on a summer evening. Step through its oak doors and you may find secrets older than the wood itself, polished, preserved, and hidden. Such was the case that evening at Haversley Court, a stately home tucked into the folds of Sussex countryside, where Hercule Poirot and I had been invited as weekend guests. The invitation, it seemed, promised little more than croquet, dinner conversation, and the kind of polite gossip one expects in the drawing rooms of the upper class. But as I have learned during my companionship with Poirot, invitations are rarely so innocent. Our hostess was Lady Eleanor Haversley, a tall, silver-haired woman of impeccable posture and the kind of quietly commanding presence that suggested she did not tolerate disorder of any kind. She greeted us with warmth, though some fleeting stiffness behind her smile, made me think that all was not quite well beneath the polished surface of her household. It was during the evening's dinner, with Poirot seated at her right, that the first whisper of trouble surfaced. The meal had been progressing pleasantly, if somewhat restrainedly, when Lady Eleanor suddenly turned to her husband, Sir Reginald, and inquired rather sharply, "Reginald, did you happen to find the letter?" The silence that followed this simple question was of the peculiar sort that immediately chills the mood of a gathering. Sir Reginald, a stout, florid gentleman with a splendid moustache, though not remotely as distinguished as Poirot's, set down his glass with a thump. "I destroyed it," he said shortly, "as you requested." But Lady Eleanor did not seem relieved. If anything, she stiffened further. "You are sure?" she demanded. "You burned it, thoroughly?" Sir Reginald gave a forced laugh. "My dear, one does not half burn paper." At this, Poirot's eyes, keen, cat-like, always seeing more than the rest of us, narrowed by the smallest fraction. "You speak," he murmured, "with certainty, monsieur. Yet paper, it has a most curious habit. When one wishes it to burn, it is obstinate. When one does not, it burns at once." He tapped his napkin lightly. "It is most illogical, most uncooperative. I do not like it." There was a murmur of polite confusion at the table. The matter was allowed to drop, or rather, was forced to drop, by Sir Reginald's insistence on discussing hunting seasons. But later that night came the screams. We were in our guest rooms when a cry rang through the house. Sharp, terrified, unmistakably female. Poirot was already halfway to the door before I even registered the sound. We hurried down the staircase, several other guests doing the same, and found the servants gathered in alarm at the entrance to Lady Eleanor's private study. She was there, standing before her fireplace, her face pale, her hands trembling. On the hearth-rug lay ash. But not enough. For in her fireplace, still smouldering, still intact, was the charred, blackened remnant of a sealed letter. A letter that refused to burn, and above it, scrawled jaggedly across the envelope, visible even through the soot, "I know what you did." Poirot stepped forward, quiet, composed. "Ah," he said softly. "Alors, the affair begins." The study in which we now stood was a handsome room, lined with bookcases and furnished in heavy mahogany. Yet its stately elegance was overshadowed by the ominous presence of the half-burned letter resting in the hearth. A faint curl of smoke still rose from it, like the last breath of some dying creature. Lady Eleanor stood rigidly by the mantelpiece, her composure frayed but not fully broken. Sir Reginald, for his part, looked unsettled in a very different way, less frightened, more cornered, as though the letter's persistence was an accusation aimed solely at him. Poirot surveyed the room with his customary precision, each detail noted, each reaction mentally catalogued. "It is curious," he said gently. "A letter intended for destruction resists the flame. That implies either deliberate interference or a peculiarity of material and sealing. But let us not begin with theories. Non, non. We begin with people." He turned to Lady Eleanor. Madame, may we intrude upon your hospitality for one evening longer? I believe it would be unwise to ignore this event. Lady Eleanor inclined her head. Monsieur Poirot, I called you here because I hoped your presence might forestall something. She hesitated, choosing her words. Something I've feared for some time. Sir Reginald let out a rather forced snort. This is nonsense, Eleanor. Some prank. Likely one of the staff. Poirot lifted a finger. No, Sir Reginald. A prank is loud and foolish. This, he gestured delicately toward the letter. This is silent and intentional. It is personal. A silence fell. I observed the assembly, which had grown as guests and residents filtered into the doorway. There was Miss Julia Haversley, the couple's niece, a young woman of 23 or thereabout, with dark eyes far too serious for her age. She watched her aunt and uncle with the expression of someone accustomed to tension in the household. Then Colonel Arthur Blakemore, retired from the Indian Army, broad-shouldered, mustached, and with the loud manner of a man who believes decisiveness compensates for lack of subtlety. He stood with arms folded, glaring as though the letter had personally insulted him. Next, Mrs. Lydia Grant, Lady Eleanor's lifelong friend and companion, slight, nervous, and fluttering at the edges like a leaf caught in a breeze. She clutched her shawl and whispered fretfully. Finally, Mr. Oliver Pemberton, a London solicitor visiting on some estate business. A thin, precise man with spectacles and an expression suggesting that everything in life should be numbered, documented, and filed alphabetically. He regarded the scene with chilly curiosity. There were others in the household, servants, groundskeepers, but it was clear the tension centered among these five. Poirot moved closer to the hearth, peering at the remnants of the letter without touching it. The message is clear, he said quietly. Someone believes there is a secret here, and that secret concerns Lady Eleanor and Sir Reginald. That person has chosen to reveal just enough to frighten, but not enough to expose. A tactic of control, of pressure. Sir Reginald turned sharply. Control? Pressure. From whom? This is absurd. A hoax. Yet his voice lacked conviction. Poirot's gaze flickered, first to the colonel, who stiffened, then to Pemberton, who blinked, then to the niece Julia, who looked away, and finally to Mrs. Grant, who was trembling noticeably. It was a small survey, lasting no more than a second or two, but I recognized Poirot's method. He was not looking at their faces so much as at their reactions to the idea of pressure. Madame, Poirot said to Lady Eleanor, this letter, it was addressed to you, yes? Lady Eleanor nodded. Yes, though I believe the original had been destroyed years ago. Poirot's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. Ah, so the content is known to you? Sir Reginald intervened brusquely. If she says the matter is finished, then it is finished. Poirot regarded him politely. And yet, here it is, not finished. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. Colonel Blakemore broke the silence. If you ask me, Poirot, the matter is straightforward. Someone found an old letter among estate papers and thought to make mischief, probably one of the junior maids. Poirot smiled. Ah, the English instinct. When in doubt, accuse the servant. He shook his head gently. None. The hand that sent this letter is educated. The phrasing is deliberate. The tone, elegant, restrained. Someone who knows exactly how to wound without striking. His gaze swept the group again. Someone in this room. Mrs. Grant let out a small cry. Julia swallowed hard. Pemberton adjusted his glasses. Sir Reginald's hand trembled before he shoved it into his pocket. The colonel scowled. Poirot continued softly, to proceed, we must understand. What is the secret this letter refers to? But we will not demand it. None. Secrets reveal themselves in their own time. He tapped his temple. We use the little grey cells. Lady Eleanor nodded slowly. Then, You will help us?" Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Madame, the affair has already engaged my interest, and Hercule Poirot does not abandon an affair once begun. I could not help but feel that the summer evening, once peaceful, had irrevocably shifted. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, watchful, waiting. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, just the beginning of a storm. The storm that had been murmuring on the horizon finally released a light rain, tapping softly at the tall windows of Haversley Court. The household had reluctantly returned to their evening rooms, and Lady Eleanor had retired with Mrs. Grant to recover her composure. Yet the atmosphere remained unsettled, stretched tight as though some invisible string connected every inhabitant to that unburned letter. Poirot requested that we use the small morning room for his interviews. It was a cheerful space, decorated in warm creams and soft blues, but tonight it felt curiously close and shadowed. A single lamp lit the polished surface of a writing desk, and Poirot stationed himself beside it, immaculate as ever, hands neatly folded, expression thoughtful, yet unreadable. "Mon ami," he said to me in a low tone, "we begin not with the facts, no, we begin with the feelings. A fact may tell you what happened, but a feeling will tell you why it happened." I sometimes suspect Poirot enjoys puzzling me, but I nodded as though this were perfectly self-evident. Our first caller was Julia Haversley. She entered with a composed step, though her fingers twisted rather nervously at the edge of her sleeve. Up close, she appeared more fragile than I had first noticed, like someone who had spent years watching rather than being seen. She sat, and Poirot regarded her with a gentle smile. "Mademoiselle, forgive me. This evening has been a shock for you, oui?" She hesitated before answering. We do not speak of it," she said at last. "Whatever happened years ago, Aunt Eleanor has tried so hard to keep the house peaceful." "Peace is not the same as silence," Poirot murmured. Her eyes flickered. "No, I suppose not." It was clear that Julia cared deeply for her aunt, and there was something protective in her tone. Yet there was also a watchfulness, a suggestion that she knew more than she would say. Poirot asked no direct questions about the letter. He simply watched her reactions. After a few gentle exchanges, he dismissed her kindly. When the door closed behind her, he remarked to me, "She knows the secret, Hastings, but she does not understand it, or she refuses to understand. This is important." Our next visitor was Colonel Blakemore, who strode in with the stiff-backed indignation of a man who feels the world has personally inconvenienced him. "Well, Poirot," he declared, "I suppose you want to ask whether I've sent any anonymous letters. I have not, and I consider the whole thing nonsense." Poirot inclined his head politely. "Colonel, you have the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but command, I think, can sometimes make enemies. Were you acquainted with Lady Eleanor's family before her marriage?" The colonel stiffened. Not noticeably, but Poirot noticed. "I knew her brother," he said shortly. "Knew the family quite well. Decent people. Decent, that is, until certain regrettable events." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, a regrettable event. Such an interesting phrase." The colonel scowled. "If you mean to drag up old gossip—" "It is not gossip I seek," Poirot interrupted softly. "It is truth." But the colonel offered no more. He left soon after, muttering under his breath. Poirot watched him go, thoughtful. He is a soldier. But his manner was not defensive. It was protective. That is a different thing entirely. Next came Mrs. Lydia Grant. She entered timidly, her hands clutching at the fringe of her shawl. She looked as though she had been crying. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot," she whispered. "This house, I always knew something like this would happen. There is so much unsaid here, so much pain." Poirot's tone softened. "Madame, you are a long-time friend, and friends see what others do not. Tell me, what do you fear?" She swallowed hard. Secrets are poison. You think they lie still, but they don't. They move. They shape lives in quiet ways. She trembled. Poirot leaned forward gently. You fear what the truth will do to Lady Eleanor? Mrs. Grant blinked rapidly, and tears welled in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes. She offered nothing more concrete than that, but her fear was palpable, real, and far more intimate than any of the others so far. When she left, Poirot remained still for a long moment. This woman, he said softly, is not frightened of blackmail. She is frightened of memory. Finally, Mr. Oliver Pemberton arrived. He sat straight-backed, his expression smooth and unreadable. I understand you require clarity, he said, steepling his fingers. I am here on legal business. I have no involvement in household affairs, past or present. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, you're a man who appreciates order. The line, the document, the stamp of finality. Pemberton nodded once. And yet, Poirot continued lightly, life is not orderly. People, they are not paper. They are chaos, emotion. He tapped his chest. Contradiction. Pemberton blinked, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something like unease, or recognition. Poirot did not press him further. When he and I were finally alone, I asked, Well, what do you make of it, Poirot? He stood, hands behind his back, looking out at the rain-swept gardens. Each suspect shows fear, he said, but each fears something different. That is the key. And Hastings. He turned to me, his voice quiet, sharpened, precise. Someone is lying, not badly, not obviously, but lying with purpose. Outside, thunder rolled again. Inside, the house held its breath. The next morning broke grey and heavy, a low mist hanging over the grounds of Haversley Court like a suspended breath. The storm had passed, but the air remained charged. Expectant, one might say, as though the house itself anticipated developments. Poirot rose earlier than usual, which always signals that he has begun arranging the threads of a case in his mind. He was immaculate, of course. Shoes gleaming, mustache impeccable, demeanor calm as a chess master preparing his opening moves. Today, mon ami, he told me over breakfast, we observe how others take action. When fear enters a household, people reveal themselves. He was right. Fear had indeed entered, and it was fear that led to the first accusation. It began shortly after breakfast, when Mrs. Hughes, the elderly housekeeper, approached Sir Reginald in the hall with visible distress. I happened to be nearby, and Poirot, without appearing to do so, drifted close enough to hear. Sir, Mrs. Hughes said, twisting her apron, I regret to trouble you, but it seems that Sarah, the young maid, was seen last night leaving Lady Eleanor's study. Sir Reginald stiffened. Leaving it? On whose word? On mine, said Colonel Blakemore, stepping forward with the air of a man who has awaited this moment. I came down for water. The girl was skulking by the study door. I saw her close the latch and hurry away down the service stairs. The colonel delivered the statement with gruff satisfaction, like a hunter announcing he had spotted the stag. Poirot's eyes half-lidded. Not in surprise. No, in evaluation. Sarah, the maid, was summoned. She appeared trembling, a slight girl with pale hands and wide, frightened eyes. I wasn't doing anything wrong, she protested before anyone accused her directly. I only heard voices earlier, and after everything last night I thought perhaps someone had left a candle burning. I swear I meant no harm. Her voice quavered, but her words held a ring of truth, or at least sincerity. However, the atmosphere of a household under strain is rarely tolerant of sincerity. Sir Reginald crossed his arms. You were in a private room. That is offence enough. And, Colonel Blakemore added pointedly, you had opportunity. Who is to say the letter was not placed there by a servant looking to make mischief? Or money? You know how gossip spreads below stairs." Poirot remained silent, watchful. Lady Eleanor, pale and drawn, had been listening from the stairwell. "If she has taken something, if she has seen something," Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice raw, "let her speak now." The maid burst into tears. "I didn't take anything. I swear it. I never touched the letter. I didn't even see one." But the narrative, once set in motion, moved with its own gravity. Mr. Pemberton, arms folded neatly, observed, "It is not uncommon, in cases involving sensitive family secrets, for household staff to be bribed or to become opportunistic when they believe something valuable can be obtained." The pieces were aligning, not by truth, but by convenience. Colonel Blakemore seized it. "There you have it. The girl is the culprit." Poirot finally spoke. "Non." The word cut cleanly through the growing storm of voices. Everyone turned. Poirot stepped forward, eyes gentle but unyielding. "Mademoiselle Sarah, have courage," he murmured. He turned to the assembly. "I will tell you why this theory fails. It is simple." He raised his hand, fingertip poised in precise emphasis. The message on the letter was written by someone intimate with Lady Eleanor's past. Someone who knew the significance of the words, "I know what you did." His voice was soft and devastating. A maid cannot threaten with a memory she never lived. Silence fell. Thunder, distant again. Poirot continued, "Also, the letter. It was sealed with a wax uncommon in modern correspondence, ivory wax with traces of sandalwood oil. This is a personal, deliberate choice, a signature, and the handwriting, it is refined, controlled, educated." He looked from face to face. "None of these things match our poor mademoiselle here, who, I believe, has not had schooling beyond the village primary." Sarah nodded tearfully, hope flickering. Poirot smiled at her, kindly. "Go, child. You are frightened, but you are innocent." She fled the room in sobs, but relieved sobs. The colonel bristled. "Poirot, you complicate matters needlessly. The letter is a threat. Threats come from the lower classes. It is simple." Poirot turned to him, and though his expression was polite, there was flint beneath it. "Simple, yes, but the truth, never simple. And you mistake cruelty for clarity, Colonel." Colonel Blakemore colored deeply. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, looked furious, not at Poirot, but at the entire situation. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. "If the girl did not send that letter," he said slowly, "then the person responsible is here, among us." Poirot bowed his head once. "Just so." Then, quietly, without drama, but with finality, "And that person is watching, always watching." The room was silent, and the house, though merely timber and stone, seemed to listen. The household did not recover easily from the failed accusation. A strange quiet settled over Haversley Court, the kind that is not peace but waiting, as though every corridor and doorway were listening for the next whisper, the next revelation. The servants moved cautiously, speaking in hushed voices. The guests avoided one another's eyes, and everywhere one turned, there was the unmistakable sensation of watchfulness. Poirot naturally moved through this atmosphere with perfect calm, if anything, invigorated by it. He observed with practiced patience, allowing the tensions of the house to simmer rather than immediately stir them. "You see, Hastings," he said to me as we walked the terrace gardens that afternoon, "when there is guilt in a house, one does not need to ask bold questions. One need only wait. The guilty person," he paused, tapping his temple lightly, "will confess themselves by how they watch the others." He let this idea hang as we re-entered the house. Poirot's quiet provocation. Poirot did not summon anyone. Instead, he simply made himself present, a quiet figure in a room, polishing his cufflinks, adjusting a vase slightly to the left, rearranging a stack of books by height rather than by subject. Poirot calls this setting the room to order. I have come to learn that it sets people to disorder. For nearly an hour, we remained in the morning room while the household came and went. No questioning, no accusations, simply presence. It was astonishing what came of that. Colonel Blakemore breaks first. The colonel returned from the stables in a mood of barely controlled irritation and, seeing Poirot rearranging a row of teacups, snapped, "For heaven's sake, man, must everything be lined up as though in parade formation?" Poirot looked up mildly. "I find that when the objects of a room are in order, a mind reveals its disorder more clearly." The colonel flushed at the implication. "I don't like being judged, Poirot." Poirot smiled. "Oh, but I do not judge. I only notice." The colonel left abruptly, boots striking the hallway with military sharpness. Poirot watched him go. "He fears disgrace," he murmured. "Not guilt, disgrace. A very English fear." Mrs. Grant, The Confession of Fear. Later, Mrs. Lydia Grant came hesitantly to the doorway, shawl clutched tight. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "Perhaps I should leave. Perhaps my presence makes things worse." Poirot motioned her inside. To leave is to run. To run is to declare that one knows something, and to declare one knows something is to make oneself a target. "Do you wish to be a target, madame?" Her breath caught. "No," she whispered. "No." "Then stay," Poirot replied gently, "and watch." She left, more frightened than when she entered. Poirot nodded to himself. She fears the truth, but she does not fear being blamed. That is important. Pemberton, the measured man, falters. Mr. Oliver Pemberton entered next, not flustered, not emotional, but with a silence that was too deliberate. He stood at the window, hands clasped behind him. "One cannot help but observe," he said evenly, "that this house has lived under the shadow of something long before last night." Poirot watched him carefully. "You speak of shadows, yet you do not say from what they fall." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "It is not my place to say." Poirot smiled softly. "Ah, but it is your place to know, and that is the burden you carry." For the first time, Pemberton looked like a man who had lost footing on a staircase. He excused himself shortly afterward, his composure cracked, just slightly. Julia, the unspoken loyalty. Julia Haversley entered last, quiet, soft-footed, as though the house itself weighed on her. She did not sit. She stood by the window, staring out at the rain. "My uncle is not a bad man," she said suddenly without prompting. "He is proud, hard sometimes, but not cruel, and whatever happened before, I think he regrets it more than anyone." Poirot did not respond at once. "Mademoiselle," he said at last, "when one defends another, it is often because one fears they will fall. What is it you fear he will lose?" Julia's lips parted, but no words came. She left a moment later, silent and pale. Poirot's eyes followed her thoughtfully. "She protects him," he murmured, "but protection is not affection." The shift in the air. We had seen all there was to see without speaking directly of the past. Poirot folded his hands behind him, thoughtful. "Hastings, there is a pattern emerging. It is delicate, like lace. Each person fears something different. The colonel fears disgrace. Mrs. Grant fears a memory. Pemberton fears knowledge itself. Julia fears loss. Sir Reginald fears exposure. And Lady Eleanor," he paused, eyes narrowing, "fears the truth." "And the letter?" I asked. Poirot's fingertips touched lightly together. "The letter is not a threat," he said. "It is a reminder." I felt a chill. "And reminders," Poirot said softly, "come only from someone who remembers." The final note of the day. That evening after dinner, A scream echoed through the house again. This time, something was gone. Someone had slipped into Lady Eleanor's study. Someone had stolen the half-burned letter, and the house was no longer merely watchful. It was hunted. The scream drew us all at once to Lady Eleanor's study, though the household seemed to move through the corridors like figures in a dream, swift, breathless, touched by dread. Lady Eleanor herself stood in the center of the room, her hand pressed to her breast, her breath trembling through parted lips. The hearth was cold now, the faint ash left from the failed burning earlier. But the thing that mattered, the thing that made Lady Eleanor's face so terribly pale, was the empty space where the half-burned letter had been. It was gone. Poirot stepped forward, hands behind his back, gaze narrowing with exact measured attention. He did not rush. Poirot never rushed. He looked first at the mantelpiece, then the hearth tiles, then the small table by the study door. Finally, he lifted his head and addressed the group assembled. "Someone has taken the letter within the last hour." Colonel Blakemore spoke first. "But who would want such a thing? Whoever wrote the blasted letter obviously knows what it contained." Poirot smiled faintly. "Not quite, Colonel. It is not the sender who needs it. It is the person who fears its contents, the person who fears exposure." Sir Reginald's face tightened. Julia gasped softly. Pemberton blinked once, too controlled, too careful. Mrs. Grant looked stricken. "Who was in the study today?" Poirot asked mildly. Lady Eleanor's voice was brittle. "No one but myself." But the brittleness, Poirot heard it. We all heard it. "Madame," Poirot said gently, "forgive me, but I do not ask who was invited to the study. I ask who was in it." Lady Eleanor closed her eyes. "Julia came to me earlier, and Reginald after luncheon, and Lydia this afternoon, and Mr. Pemberton. He delivered documents." Poirot nodded. "So 4 opportunities, and perhaps a 5th if we count the Colonel, though he strikes me as someone who enters rooms loudly, not quietly." The Colonel bristled. "Quite right, sir." Poirot continued, "We must ask ourselves a question. The letter has changed hands. Does this mean the person who took it wishes to hide the truth, or to wield it?" A hush fell. Then something moved in the doorway. Sarah, the maid, her hands clasped, tears brimming. "I am sorry," she whispered, "but I saw someone, earlier. I saw someone leaving the study." The room tensed like a bowstring. Poirot turned, soft and precise. "Go on, mademoiselle." She swallowed, voice thin and trembling. "I didn't say before because I thought I might make things worse. But I saw Mr. Pemberton leaving the study just before dinner." All eyes turned to the solicitor. Pemberton did not flinch, but neither did he show surprise. He simply adjusted his glasses. "Yes," he said calmly. "I was in the study. I delivered the estate ledger documents Lady Eleanor had requested. That was all." Poirot's eyes sharpened, very slightly but unmistakably. "And you touched nothing?" "No." Poirot regarded him for a long moment, long enough that even I felt unsettled. And then Lady Eleanor spoke, not to Pemberton, but with the hollow tone of someone whose thoughts have wandered far from the room. "It is happening again," she murmured, "after all these years." Silence drew inward around her. Julia went to her side, placing a hand gently around her shoulders. "Aunt Eleanor, please. You mustn't." But Lady Eleanor continued as though the words had a momentum of their own now. "There was another letter, 20 years ago, the same handwriting, the same tone, the same accusation." She shuddered. Poirot bowed his head, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "The original," he said softly. "The letter which Sir Reginald claimed he burned." Sir Reginald looked away. Lady Eleanor's next words came like something pulled from the depths of memory. "It came after my brother died, after the inquest, after the report said it was accidental." Her throat tightened. But someone did not believe that. Colonel Blakemore's reaction was immediate. A stiffening of the shoulders, a flash of something in his eyes. Not guilt, no. Recognition. Poirot turned slightly, observing him. Ah. A note. A cord. Something connecting. But Lady Eleanor was not finished. Someone believed I was to blame. The room seemed to compress, breathless. Julia whispered, "Aunt Eleanor, don't." Lady Eleanor looked at Poirot directly, painfully. And the worst part, Monsieur Poirot, is that sometimes I think they may be right. It was a confession, but not of guilt, a confession of burden. Poirot stepped closer, not gentle, not unkind, but precise. "Non," he said quietly. "There is much you do not know, much you believed, because it was easier to believe pain than truth." He straightened, eyes now alight with something sharp and certain. "The disappearance of the letter tells me one thing. The threat is not from the outside, it is from within the family." Sir Reginald flinched. Colonel Blakemore inhaled sharply. Mrs. Grant covered her mouth to keep from crying out. Julia shook her head in horror, as though she had known all along. And Pemberton did nothing, which was in Poirot's mind everything. The storm was nearing its heart. The past was no longer memory, it was present. The disappearance of the letter changed the atmosphere of Haversley Court entirely. Where before there had been anxiety, now there was something sharper, calculation perhaps, a quiet shift in posture, in eye contact, in where people chose to stand in a room. We were no longer dealing with a mystery still forming. The mystery was now in motion, its players aware that every step mattered. Poirot said nothing of his conclusions. He rarely does at this stage. Instead, he took a walk. Not a brisk walk, nor a contemplative one. No, Poirot's walks are deliberate. A movement made to allow thought to click, to lock, to settle. I've seen him solve half a murder during one such stroll. This walk took us to the old garden behind the east wing of the house. The garden was beautiful once, no doubt, but it had fallen into disrepair. Roses overgrown, hedges creeping toward wildness, a stone bird bath cracked with time. It was the sort of garden that remembered better years and now dreamed of them in silence. Poirot stopped at a wrought-iron bench and sat. "Hastings," he said, "have you ever observed how people destroy things?" I was quite sure I had not given the matter much philosophical thought. "Well, I suppose one burns what one wishes to be rid of." Poirot nodded. "Just so. But if one wishes to keep the memory, one does not burn. One hides. One locks away. One keeps close what one claims to despise." He looked at me, his eyes bright with meaning. "The first letter," he said, "that is the key. The one Sir Reginald said he burned. But paper, Hastings, even the most fragile, does not vanish without trace. If a man claims it has vanished entirely, it is often because he has put it somewhere safe." I blinked. "You think Sir Reginald kept it?" Poirot smiled. "I know he kept it." Before I could absorb this, a figure appeared at the far end of the garden. Colonel Blakemore. He was smoking, staring out across the wintering rose bushes. He looked less like a soldier now, and more like a man pressed between memory and duty. Poirot stood and walked toward him, slowly, lightly, as one approaches a nervous horse. "Colonel," he greeted, "a beautiful morning, is it not?" Blakemore did not turn. "I should think it's a damned unpleasant one under the circumstances." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "The circumstances are only unpleasant because they are unfinished. When truth is settled, Colonel, the house will breathe again." Blakemore exhaled smoke. "You speak as though truth is some noble thing. It isn't. Truth destroys families. Truth ruins reputations." Poirot's voice remained soft. "Ah, reputation. That is what you fear?" At last, Blakemore turned. His face was not angry now. It was tired. The Haversley name has stood for generations. Eleanor, she is a good woman. Flawed, yes. Stubborn. And her brother was my friend. A reckless fool, but my friend. The faint tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Poirot did not press. Not yet. "Tell me, Colonel," he said instead, "why did you never marry?" The question startled even me. Blakemore stared. What on earth does that have to do with anything? Poirot only waited. Blakemore's gaze finally faltered. "Because," he said quietly, "there are loyalties that run deeper than marriage." Poirot nodded once. "Merci, Colonel." He turned away, leaving the soldier staring into the ruined roses. As we walked back toward the house, I attempted to pass what had just occurred. "Poirot," I said, "what was that?" Poirot smiled, ever so slightly. "An admission, mon ami. Colonel Blakemore is loyal to Lady Eleanor. He would protect her reputation. But loyalty born out of affection is not the same as loyalty born out of guilt. He protects not her actions, he protects her memory of herself." Poirot paused at the terraced doors. "But memory," he added softly, "is often the great liar." Poirot returns to the study. The study felt different now, not ominous, purposeful. Poirot moved through it with the grace of a man reconstructing a crime not of violence, but of emotion. He examined the hearth again, then the writing desk, then the waste bin. At last, he stopped before the fireplace tools. One in particular, an iron poker. He lifted it, examined the faint soot patterns, the faint residue. "Hastings," he said quietly. "Someone reheated the letter." I stared. But why? Poirot set the poker down. "To remove something from it." I frowned. What could possibly be removed from a half-burned letter? Poirot looked at me then, not with condescension, but with sadness. The letter originally contained something more than accusation, something more than words. His voice dropped to a whisper. It contained proof. My breath caught. A photograph, a clipping, a signed name. Poirot did not say, but his silence answered enough. Someone in the house had not only taken the letter, they had taken the evidence that could have shattered everything. And now, the truth was not only hidden, it was being managed. The night that followed was heavy and airless, as though the entire house were holding itself still. I found sleep impossible, my mind turning over the events of the last days in circles that led nowhere. Poirot, by contrast, seemed remarkably composed. He sat in the armchair by the window, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled under his chin, thinking, always thinking. "Hastings," he murmured at one point, "guilt is like perfume. Even in the faintest quantities it lingers, it clings, it betrays." I did not know which of the household he referred to. Perhaps all of them. Then came the knock. A hesitant sound, no urgency, just the quiet insistence of someone who feared being seen asking for help. Poirot rose and opened the door. Julia Haversley stood there, pale as moonlight. She clutched a book to her chest, and her eyes were wide with something like dread. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "I must show you something. Please, come. Now." Poirot nodded once and gestured for me to follow. The East Wing. We accompanied Julia down a long corridor, seldom used by the household. The air was colder here, the wallpaper faded, the carpets thin with age. This was the part of the house that had been closed, not formally, but emotionally. A place of things left behind. Julia stopped outside a door at the very end and held her breath before opening it. "This was my uncle's room," she said. Poirot stepped inside. It was a room of dust and memory, a writing desk in the corner, a wardrobe, a single framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a young man in officer's uniform, the same dark eyes as Lady Eleanor. The brother. Poirot moved slowly, examining the room without touching anything. Julia's voice trembled. My uncle died here, not in some boating accident in Cornwall. That was only where they found him. He came home first. He argued with Aunt Eleanor and Uncle Reginald. I heard it. I was only a child, but I remember. Poirot nodded, to acknowledge, not encourage. They said it was the drink, that he had become unstable. But I remember, her fingers clenched tighter around the book she held. He kept saying he had discovered something terrible, something that would ruin us all. She swallowed. I thought, perhaps the old letter, perhaps it had something to do with this room. So I came here, and I found this. She handed Poirot the book. It was a diary. The brothers. Poirot opened it carefully. The writing was erratic, the ink blotched in places as though written in haste or distress. The entries were fragmented, notes about family disputes, mentions of debts, veiled references to someone he trusted who betrayed him. But one passage stood clear. Eleanor thinks I am weak. Reginald fears I will tell. The Colonel knows more than he should. Lydia sees everything but speaks nothing. And Pemberton. Pemberton knows how to hide what cannot be erased. Poirot read the lines twice, then closed the diary. And this page, Julia whispered, trembling, was folded, hidden, as though he didn't want it to be found, but also didn't want to destroy it. Poirot looked at her gently. You believe your uncle was driven to his death? Julia shook her head. No, I believe he was pushed. The silence that followed was thick. Poirot placed the diary carefully on the desk. Mademoiselle, you have done something very brave, he said, and very dangerous. She shivered. Poirot, is it my Uncle Reginald? Did he... Poirot raised a hand. No. Do not ask what you do not yet understand. The truth is not a hammer to strike with. It is a mirror to see with. Julia nodded, tears glistening. Poirot spoke again, softly but with absolute clarity. Your uncle did not keep the first letter because he feared scandal. He kept it because he loved your aunt. The truth, whatever it was, would have destroyed her, and so he chose to let the world believe the lie instead. Julia covered her mouth, trembling now. But someone else, someone who was here then, has chosen to revive the past. Poirot's eyes gleamed with realization, and the letter's disappearance now tells us something new. I leaned forward. What? Poirot turned to both of us. The person who stole the letter does not fear the truth itself. They fear that the truth will come out without their control. They wish to reveal it, but on their own terms. My mind reeled. Then the culprit, Poirot finished softly, is not the one who hides. It is the one who prepares. He looked toward the corridor. Someone is staging the past. We returned to the main hall to the sound of raised voices. Sir Reginald and Colonel Blakemore stood nose to nose, shouting accusations, and at the center of the storm, Lady Eleanor, still, silent, watching. Poirot stepped forward. Enough, he said quietly. They fell silent at once. Poirot looked around the circle of faces, fearful, guilty, breaking. It is time, he said, for the truth to be spoken. They looked at him with dread, and in that moment I understood. This was no longer a mystery of evidence. This was a mystery of conscience, and conscience was about to break. It was near dusk when Poirot requested that everyone gather in the main drawing room. The request was polite, but it carried a weight that permitted no refusal. One by one, they arrived. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed, her hands folded in her lap. Sir Reginald, jaw clenched, posture stiff with the strain of something long buried. Julia, sitting near her aunt, eyes raw from sleepless worry. Colonel Blakemore, standing rather than sitting as though ready for some battlefield command. Mrs. Grant, shrinking near the fringes of the circle, shawl drawn tight, eyes glassy with dread. Mr. Pemberton, upright, precise, as though already preparing his defense. The light from the tall windows had grown thin and amber, shadows reaching long across the floorboards. The moment felt suspended, time holding its breath. Poirot did not initially join the arrangement of chairs. He began by walking the perimeter of the room slowly, hands behind his back, as though taking inventory of the very air. When he spoke, the voice was quiet, but the silence answered it. Poirot sets the stage. "My friends," he began, "we have reached the moment where the truth must be spoken, not in anger, though there has been anger, not in fear, though there has been much fear, but because the truth, once confined, begins to rot. And when it decays, it poisons all who keep it." He turned to Lady Eleanor. "Madame, your brother did not die by accident." Gasps, a sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Grant, a curse under Colonel Blakemore's breath, Julia's hand tightening around her aunt's. Lady Eleanor's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Poirot continued. "What happened all those years ago was a tragedy of emotion, not malice. Your brother had discovered something that shocked him, something he intended to expose. There was an argument. Words were spoken that cannot be taken back. He left the house in a state of collapse." Poirot paused, letting the weight of memory settle. He drowned that night, but it was grief, not murder, that drove him to the sea. Sir Reginald exhaled, long, ragged, as though a weight had been waiting decades to fall. But Poirot raised a hand. "This is not the secret that threatens this household now. No, the tragedy did not end with death. It began there." He turned to Colonel Blakemore. "Colonel, you knew the brother best. You have carried loyalty like a shield, but you have also carried silence." The colonel's throat flexed. "I tried to protect Eleanor," he said quietly. She blamed herself. If the truth had come out, then what it would have done to her. She would have shattered. Poirot nodded. "So you helped hide the truth?" The colonel closed his eyes. "Yes." Poirot turned now to Mrs. Grant. "And you, madame? You saw things no one else saw, the small tears in the curtain of the family's composure. You said nothing, not out of fear, but out of love." Mrs. Grant began to cry silently. Poirot stepped nearer, his voice gentle. "But the truth, once buried, does not rest. It haunts." The letter. He walked to the fireplace. The first letter appeared shortly after the brother's death. A letter accusing Lady Eleanor of having caused her brother's ruin. A letter that contained, or claimed to contain, evidence. Sir Reginald's voice cracked. "I burned it. I thought it would save her." Poirot turned sharply. "No, you hid it. You burned only what surrounded it, not what mattered." Julia looked at him, breath caught. "The photo," she whispered. "There was a photograph." Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Yes. A photograph that had never surfaced. A photograph someone has now retrieved. Someone among them." Poirot's psychological net tightens. Poirot paced once more, slowly. You see, the purpose of the recent letter was not merely to accuse, it was to reopen a wound. Someone believed the past had not yet been paid for. Someone who has lived under the weight of this secret all these years. He looked, one by one, into each face. Lady Eleanor, grief-stricken, but not guilty. Sir Reginald, protective, weary, but steadfast. Colonel Blakemore, loyal to the end. Mrs. Grant, frightened of what truth will destroy. Julia, young, but bearing the quiet sorrow of inheritance. Pemberton, impassive, but too impassive. Poirot's voice deepened. If one wishes to punish, one accuses loudly, but if one wishes to control, one reveals slowly. His gaze rested on Pemberton. The solicitor did not react, which, in Poirot's logic, was a reaction. Poirot turned to the room. There is one among you who has lived not in grief, nor in guilt, but in belief. Belief that justice was never done. Belief that the truth was stolen. Belief that someone must pay. The air tightened. The letter writer, Poirot said softly, is one who remembers, not what happened, but what they believed should have happened. Julia's hands trembled violently. Sir Reginald whispered, "No, surely not." Lady Eleanor inhaled sharply, realization forming. But Poirot lifted a hand. "No, I will name the guilty one in time. But first," he gestured to the diary on the table, "I must show you what was written that night, and why." The room held its breath. The reveal was no longer distant. It had entered the room. The drawing room was silent except for the faint ticking of the long case clock near the window. Outside, the dusk had deepened, the sky bruised into violet shadows. Poirot waited until he was certain every pair of eyes was fixed upon him. Only then did he begin. "My friends," he said softly, "before I name the guilty one, we must understand why this affair began. Motive, always, is the heart." He crossed to the mantelpiece and placed his fingertips lightly against the cold marble. 20 years ago, Lady Eleanor's brother returned to Haversley Court after discovering a terrible truth. Not about his sister, not about her husband. No. Poirot turned, his gaze sweeping the room. The truth he discovered was about himself. Julia's breath caught. Poirot continued gently. He had fallen deeply into debt. He had gambled on the London markets. He forged a signature on a banking document, believing he could fix it before anyone noticed. But someone did notice. Sir Reginald closed his eyes. He already knew this. He had always known. He confessed to Lady Eleanor, Poirot said, and she, loving him as she did, offered to cover the debt to protect the family name. She begged him to start anew. Poirot's voice softened, but he refused. Shame, Hastings. Shame is a powerful force. He believed he had ruined his sister's life, that he was unworthy of her protection, and in his despair, he walked into the sea. A faint sob broke from Julia. Poirot continued. The inquest called it an accident, because Lady Eleanor could not bear the truth, and Sir Reginald, wanting to protect her, allowed the world to believe the lie. He hid the letter that accused Eleanor mistakenly, because to expose it would mean confessing the brother's guilt, his shame, and his final despair. Colonel Blakemore bowed his head, grief carved into his features. Poirot paused, then his tone sharpened. But there was someone in the house who did not accept that explanation. Someone who believed Lady Eleanor had caused the death. Someone who believed she should have stopped him. Someone who watched him suffer. Someone who loved him. Mrs. Grant gasped and clutched her shawl. Poirot turned. "Mrs. Lydia Grant." She froze, not with surprise, but with the stillness of someone who has been waiting to be named. The motive Poirot's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. "You were in love with Eleanor's brother. You loved him deeply, quietly, without acknowledgement, without hope. You watched him confide in Eleanor, turn to Eleanor, trust Eleanor, and when he died, you did not blame him. You blamed her." Mrs. Grant's hands trembled violently. "You believed she could have saved him. You believed she should have prevented his despair. You believed she did not suffer enough." A sob escaped her, small, broken. Poirot continued softly. "So you wrote a letter, many years ago. A letter that accused Eleanor of the death. A letter which Sir Reginald discovered and concealed." Poirot stepped closer. "But your grief did not fade. It fermented. It sharpened. It hardened into something very cold. The room was utterly still. You waited, you watched, and, when the household grew comfortable again, when the memory had finally begun to sleep, he looked directly into Mrs. Grant's eyes. You woke it. Mrs. Grant let out a sharp, shuddering breath. She shook her head once, violently. I only wanted her to remember," she whispered. She acted as if it had never happened, as if she were the only one who had the right to grieve. Tears slipped down Julia's cheeks. Lady Eleanor stared at her old friend with a sorrow almost too deep for expression. "You stole the half-burned letter," Poirot said gently, "because it contained more than accusation. It contained a photograph of him, the one you took, the last one. You could not allow Eleanor to see that, because it would reveal the truth, that his agony came not from her, but from you." Mrs. Grant collapsed into the nearest chair, sobbing. "I loved him," she gasped. "I loved him, and he never saw me. He only ever saw her." Poirot placed a hand over his heart. "Yes, and so you blamed her for his blindness." The final stroke. Poirot stepped back. But this affair of letters and ash, it could have ended quietly. Yet you escalated it. Why? Because you believed Eleanor still had not suffered enough. He sighed, not harsh, but weary. But love that turns to vengeance poisons only the one who holds it. The room remained silent for a long moment. Mrs. Grant did not lift her head. Justice and closure. Sir Reginald spoke first, voice hollow but steady. "She will not be prosecuted." Poirot nodded. "No crime of law remains. Only a crime of the heart." Colonel Blakemore exhaled, shoulders sagging. Julia knelt beside Mrs. Grant. Not forgiving, but understanding grief. Lady Eleanor approached slowly, fragile as a china figure, and laid a hand gently upon her friend's trembling back. And in that moment the house seemed to breathe again. Not healed, but released. Poirot looked to me, eyes soft. "You see, Hastings, human tragedy is rarely about wickedness. It is about sorrow, misplaced, misunderstood, unspoken." He straightened his cuffs. "The case is closed." Haversley Court was noticeably different in the days that followed. Not in its structure. The grand stone walls remained, the tall windows still caught the afternoon light. But in its air, the silence that once felt watchful now seemed simply quiet. The halls no longer held their breath. They exhaled. Yet healing, as I have learned at Poirot's side, is rarely neat. It does not announce itself with clarity. It is made of small adjustments, a look softened, a voice lowered, a pause before speaking. And at Haversley Court, such adjustments had just begun. Mrs. Grant remained in her room for 2 days. When she emerged, she did not avoid Lady Eleanor, nor did she seek her. They existed in the same rooms carefully, like two musicians relearning an old melody in which one wrong note had broken the rhythm years ago. The colonel resumed his regular rides in the early morning fields, though his movements were slower now, his posture less rigid. His loyalty had not wavered. If anything, it had deepened. But something in him had shifted. He could no longer protect the past, only the living. Julia seemed to walk with a new steadiness. The house no longer burdened her with history she could not name. She had heard it. She had faced it. And now she could choose what to keep. The girl who had once watched from corners now moved through rooms openly. The transformation was quiet, but profound. As for Sir Reginald, I believe the revelation cost him dearly, but he carried the weight differently now, less as punishment, more as shared truth. His silences became less defensive, more reflective. The man who once guarded his composure like armor was gradually allowing himself to be simply weary. Lady Eleanor, though, the change in her was the most striking. She walked now as though her footsteps acknowledged the floor. She spoke without bracing herself first. Her grief remained, it always would. But it was no longer clenched inside her. It had been spoken, named, seen. There is great relief in being seen. Poirot and I prepared to leave 2 mornings later. A mist clung to the gardens, pale and gentle, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and damp earth. Haversley Court looked almost young again in that soft light. Lady Eleanor came to see us off. She wore no jewelry, no brooches or pearls today, just a simple pale dress. Her face was composed, but not masked. She carried a small envelope in her hand. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "I do not know how to thank you." Poirot bowed slightly. "You owe me nothing, madame. I've done only what must be done when a wound festers. One must bring air to it." Eleanor glanced toward the old garden where the roses slept beneath winter. "I've spent so many years trying not to remember," she whispered. "I see now that remembering is the only way to go on." Poirot smiled gently. "We cannot change what has been, but we can choose what it becomes." She nodded, then placed the envelope in his hand. "This was found in the old desk. I think it is something of his, something you should see." Poirot opened it only after we were in our carriage. Inside was a faded photograph. Lady Eleanor's brother standing with a young woman, Mrs. Grant, long before sorrow carved itself into her expression. They were laughing, not posing, not arranged. Alive. Poirot looked at it for a long time. Then he returned it to the envelope and slipped it into his coat. "You are keeping it?" I asked. "No," he said, looking out the carriage window. "I will post it back later today. It belongs to the living Hastings, not the dead." We drove in silence for some time, the gravel road stretching behind us like a trail into memory. Finally, I asked, "Poirot, if Mrs. Grant had confessed years ago, would any of this have changed?" Poirot turned his head toward me, his expression thoughtful, compassionate, deeply human. "No, mon ami, because grief is not changed by time, only by truth." I considered that. "And Lady Eleanor, do you think she will find peace?" Poirot's eyes softened. "She will find something better. She will find understanding." He paused, then added with quiet conviction, "And understanding, Hastings, is the only real peace the human heart may hope to know." The carriage turned onto the main road. Haversley Court receded from view. The fog lifted, and Hercule Poirot, with his coat buttoned precisely and his moustache immaculate even after a case of such emotional weight, closed his eyes and rested his fingertips together. Not content, not triumphant, but serene. For the truth, spoken at last, had done what truth must. It had set everyone free.